Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kaufman. So we have seen this story happening in the news a while. It's sort of resurfaced and really talking about wolves as they start to or have been repopulating a lot in Europe. And as we get closer to the Russia border and inside of Belarus and things like that, there has been this story about wolves in the Chernobyl area that may possibly have keys to curing cancer and things like that genetically. So who better to bring on than someone who has been doing this research? She has been a biologist since 2005, but has been a postdoctoral fellow for 2.5 years in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University, where she joins us from. And she is Cara Love. Cara, it's great to meet you and great to be able to speak about all this stuff with you. How's everything going?
Thanks so much for having me. Oh, it's great. Other than the weather, things are great. Yeah, in the middle of a rainstorm.
Our weathers are always all over the place. Yeah, it's sunny in California and then it's thunderstorming over there. So that's always fun. So just to start, just give everybody who's listening a background for you. How did you become a biologist, want to become a biologist? Was nature and animals a thing for you in your younger years, or how did that all come about?
Yeah, good question. I think as far back as I can remember, I remember being fascinated with how animals just interacted with their environment and the world around them. Like I was so fascinated by red F's or like spotted newts that would come out, and just the way that they moved was fascinating, let alone how they interacted with the rest of their life cycle and the environment. Um, and then at some point, I kind of got really intrigued about how we as humans, we're just this integral part of the environment, how we interact with the environment, how the environment interacts with us. And I couldn't help but notice how big of an impact we have on so much of the surrounding ecosystems. And well, I mean, we're in the Anthropocene, right? So there is literally nowhere in the world that we have not touched. I don't really know how old I was when I had that connection form specifically, but it's always something that's been intriguing and fascinating to me, and something that I feel like is just really important in understanding as we kind of move forward and navigate this really rapidly changing world. So I guess the short answer is ever since I can remember, I've been intrigued by it.
Yeah. I mean, when you're studying biology and you're going into postdoctorates and you're using, your brain in terms of I want to say the scholastic sense, what can you bring out of the naturalistic sense? Like you say, as you're navigating the natural world yourself as a child and a younger adult, do you carry those things with you in any type of your studies and using, I guess, your experiences, like you say, just from loving the natural world and understanding our, meaning human impact on it? Do you bring that into any of your studies, into any of your postdoctorates? What is the key for those experiences in order to influence maybe your scholastic experience?
Yeah, to me, they're kind of one and the same. um, they're definitely a personal inspiration, but I think for me, biology, it wasn't always what I thought I would do with the rest of my career until I hit undergrad. And then it's when I started taking biology classes and I really got into it and kind of followed my biology career from there. I didn't go straight through from undergrad to postdoc. There were many twists and turns along the way. I took different jobs that led me in different directions before heading into grad school and everything. But they were all biology focused in one way or another. And it kind of helped me narrow down my area of research. But I think just the curiosity of how the world works around us. And it's not so much maybe like species specific. Like, don't get me wrong, I love wolves and I love this system and I think it's incredible. But it's really about the question and about what you can ask surrounding that question and surrounding that species and surrounding that ecosystem. That's really fascinating to me. So it's my work is really interdisciplinary. I pull a lot from cancer biology. I pull a lot from immunology, disease ecology, ecology, ecotoxicology, evolutionary biology, to kind of build this like bigger picture of what is actually happening in the system. And it just so happens that wolves are just this really fantastic model species to use to kind of get at some of the questions we're interested in. So I think the curiosity that I kind of was born with or like came with from a young age has just kind of spurred my inspiration. And the further I get, the more curious I am, and the more questions we have, right? The more we learn, the more questions we
Right.
have to ask. So there's always more.
Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, let's hop into it because I mean, I feel I think we both feel your enthusiasm about this, and that's what's so great to have somebody who's really into the research and really into studying these things. And I guess we'll just go into the background. I think anybody who's listening, or I would say most anybody who's listening, obviously knows about the tragedy of Chernobyl in 1986 and when the reactor blew. And there's an incredible series that's on HBO that document. It's obviously, I think walks the line between fiction and fact or whatever it may be. It's really sparked and what you said earlier on just a few minutes ago of how much impact we as humans have on all the ecosystems, and there's nothing we haven't touched. So clearly this was something that a massive tragedy, an exclusion zone that is it's when we say CEZ, we're going to say that just to, bring it down a little bit. It's as the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and that's located in Ukraine and Belarus. And it's devoid of humans, but in all of the articles and some of the articles I've been reading up on you, Cara, is that even though devoid of humans, really is serving as a wildlife sanctuary to a degree, in that certain bison, wolves, I think lynx, there are species there that are really thriving sans humans at this point. So what, I guess going back to the beginning of maybe your postdoctorate, where you said, hey, what was the call to study this specific area and then just say this specific species just at the start before we get into the other stuff?
Yeah. So I should say this is a project that I became a part of in 2014, 2013. So this has been kind of the culmination. Every step we took gave us a bit more information, and we're just kind of able to add many more layers and becoming a postdoc and being able to take it to this next layer of really investigating kind of the evolutionary impacts with Shane and his group here at Princeton was just kind of the natural next step. But like you mentioned, this is, I mean, one of the most dramatic human accidents in the world of
Yeah.
Chernobyl. It's still one of the most highly radioactive environments in the world. Um,
Hmm.
it, like you said, it happened in 1986, so it happened a few decades ago, and there were over 100,000 pounds of radioactive material that was released into the atmosphere that then was deposited across much of Europe and what was the USSR. It's now, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Um, but it really left this environment that was so heavily contaminated that the governments decided to evacuate almost like 200,000 people, a tremendous number of people from the most highly radioactive area. And some of those people were able to move back. Some of those people were evacuated with like saying that they would be back in 3 days. And so they were only allowed a couple of suitcases. So there's still houses that have kind of been untouched since then because they were never able to go back once the um, the level of contamination was thoroughly understood. But that was because of the detrimental impacts that radiation has, right? They were trying to
Right.
protect the humans from cancer and the potential catastrophe on the health end for the people. But with humans not in the area anymore, wildlife have repopulated, and the Belarusian government actually uses it as a nature reserve, like you mentioned. So they've reintroduced a lot of threatened and endangered species into the area. And partly because of the void of human residence, they've been able to proliferate and survive there despite the radiation. So it's kind of this unique model system where you have this tremendous biodiverse group of individuals living with this potentially very physiologically taxing stressor. But that's kind of where we started with the system of not knowing, right? Like, are they exposed to enough radiation that could be a long-term evolutionary force? And that's kind of where we started. Tom Hinton is a radioecologist that had been working on kind of developing these new radio collars that we attach that have dosimeters so we can get real-time location and radiation dose information from the individuals. Wolves are large enough that they're also able to hold it. So one amazing reason that they're a great study system. Um, so one of our first questions was just, how much radiation are they exposed to? And we realized that they're exposed to dramatically higher levels than wolves just outside of the zone. Not only that, but they have higher levels of radiocesium activity within their body, which means that they're integrating these high levels because they're higher on the trophic level. So they're eating organisms that are also living in this contaminated environment, which means that they're biomagnifying a lot of this contamination within their body. So they're receiving an internal dose and an external dose. And that was kind of one of the first indicators that maybe there could be a physiological stress that could have evolutionary implications in this species specifically.
Wow. So, well, without much context, but I'm sure we'll get into it. But how does a place that something like 1 million humans had to evacuate from in a hurry become the same place where the same contamination and radiation that was dangerous to humans is also curing cancer in other species and hopefully somehow in humans in the future? But how scientifically do we make sense of that?
Yeah, good question. So I would say we don't know that it's curing cancer specifically yet. We see signs that the wolf population has adapted to the radiation in a way that is indicative of anti-tumor immunity.
I see.
But we can't say that they don't get cancer. When we look at the genomic patterns within the population within Belarus, we can look at different patterns that measure and are signatures of evolution. And those are the highest. So we're seeing the fastest rates of evolution in genes that are associated with immune biology, cancer physiology, and anti-tumor immunity. And we know this because, they're well documented in humans, but the close ancestor, the dog, is this incredible model system for cancer in humans. So we have like this tremendous data set to rely on from the dogs that are also translatable to the wolves. And we can really kind of get at more of that functional underpinning. So I wouldn't say that we entirely know that they aren't getting cancer yet, but they're at least on their way, it seems.
That's wild. So is it just that these wolves are being exposed to many triggers to cancer, and the ones that survive that have a natural resistance or immunity to cancer are getting a chance to breed?
Yeah, exactly. So especially with rapid evolution in a short time frame, we're kind of expecting that there's this tremendous amount of genetic variation that's existent within the population. And some of these variations are going to be beneficial in a cancer context, and some of these are not going to be beneficial in a cancer context.
Yeah.
And when you aren't exposed to a cancer stressor, maybe all that's neutral. Maybe it doesn't matter what variant you have in those genes, right? But as soon as you're exposed to radiation, which is a really strong cancer stressor, maybe it does mean that you have higher survival if you have that particular variant within that gene.
Right.
So just like you said, they would have higher survival and be able to reproduce at a greater rate.
Gosh, man, evolution is so interesting. It's just bananas. So, but what are the substances in and around Chernobyl that if you were to take a sample of water, for example, would be in there?
Yeah, so there were a few radioisotopes that were released at the time of the explosion, but the ones that are still current now are mostly radiocesium 137 and strontium 90.
Oh,
And those, I mean, they're both radionuclides, right? They both have different wavelengths that they met, and some of them are more detrimental because of the energy that's released from the atom itself. They can like release energy that breaks DNA, which increases mutation rate because the DNA is trying to repair itself, and then sometimes it gets it right, sometimes it doesn't, which is part of why it's a cancer stressor, because if that mismatch is not correct, it could insert a mutation that then that cell freaks out. It's like, I'm not right, I'm going to grow not right, and all of a sudden you have a tumor created. But yeah, been a lot of research in other species from Chernobyl, but I mean, there are lots of reasons why wolves are cool. I'm sure we'll cover them
Yeah,
on as we go. But one of them is that they're just longer lived than a lot of the species that have been examined. So there's been a tremendous amount of work with voles that shows some similar signatures of stress, but they haven't quite taken the data quite this far, but they also have a way shorter lifespan. And for the mutations to kind of accumulate in a body and for cancer to develop, it can take time depending on the species. So the wolf has a longer life of, at least half a decade, if not a full decade, slightly more, to potentially accumulate that and really have the potential to develop an increased cancer load.
I see. Wow.
Holy cow. So what levels of radiation are we talking about that they're still accumulating at? Because I know it's still an exclusion zone, which means humans are still not able to inhabit there. But what readings are you guys getting off of these collars? And I guess explain what that would in relation to what it would mean. I guess X amount of whatever radiation that they're getting is equitable to what?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit. The way that radiation was deposited on the landscape was really heterogeneous, depending on topography, plant matter, lots of
Wind, all
different
that
factors.
stuff, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it depends on where the individual is and also how much time they spend there. And so of all the wolves that we've collared, we have a range, but they can be exposed to up to approximately like 3 chest x-rays a day of radiation, multiple dental, that would be similar to multiple dental x-rays a day of radiation
Right.
per day. But it really depends on the individual how much, but every single one of them is exposed to upwards of 30 times more radiation than a wolf from a reference area that's just outside of the zone.
Wow. Yeah. So obviously that's something if the human body was to take that amount of radiation per day, we're talking this would develop obviously stuff, we would develop tumors and cancer. Is that how it would work? That amount of radiation, or it would just break down, like you said, cellular structure, DNA structure? Is that what would eventually happen for humans if they were to go back in and be there for as long as I guess they could, up until death, if that's the case, if that's what we're going at?
Yeah, that is the fear. But we actually don't know that much about chronic radiation in humans. So having a model like the wolves is also very helpful and cool because we can actually tell if there's long-term physiological stress of this chronic radiation. Most
Yeah.
of what we know about radiation exposure in humans is from a health perspective, usually cancer treatment. So it's very
Right.
acute, it's very targeted. It's not whole body. I mean, we know some from Chernobyl or like the atomic bomb survivors, which do develop higher rates of cancer and higher rates of immune diseases. So it's kind of a case study, but we as humans also, we're so variable, right? Our behavior is so variable. We eat different things. We consume different levels of alcohol, or we smoke at different rates, or just all these other
Right.
stressors as well. So I think this is one of the ways that I think like using animals as a model system is super cool because we can kind of get to these questions way more targeted than we can with a human population and just don't have quite as many variables at play.
Right.
So I assume when you're researching this stuff, it's like blood samples. I mean, how do you collect those? And when you guys are in that area collecting samples, what precautions do you have to take in an area like Chernobyl?
Yeah. So I went with a team of researchers and we live trapped wolves, collected blood, collected all sorts of different samples, attached the collars. Um, we were very cautious. So we always wore PPE. We had respirators that we would wear anytime we were interacting with the soil, particularly. Most of the radiation is within the soil. So you just don't want to consume it or breathe it in. So we'd wear respirators. We would wear full on rubber suits if we were going to be interacting with mud or a wolf if we had trapped a wolf, just to kind of protect ourselves. And we also wore dosimeters. So they were set to alarm. If we were in an area that was too high in radiation, our alarm would go off and we would be able to move out of that area. But because we were so cautious within, we were there for, let's say, one of our trips was a month and a half that we were in the zone shopping. Over the course of that time, I was only exposed to the amount of radiation that you get from a round trip flight from New York to Tokyo. So if you're conscious about it and you have the equipment to help you navigate it, it's you can be more safe about it for sure. And there actually are some people who still live within the Chernobyl exclusion zone.
Really?
There were certain people that were able to get permission to move back after they were childbearing age. The government allowed them to move back to their communities, and they are still living. It's like, what is the bigger stressors? The bigger stressor being put into a community that you don't know anyone and that might not be as welcoming to you.
Yeah.
Or is it more stressful to be around radiation? Or namely, I mean, right now that whole region is under a tremendous amount of stress for other reasons too. But
yeah,
it's kind of weigh your pros and cons, and some people did choose to move back. So
is this considered like insane research to go do this, or are there other folks in other fields, other scientists, researchers in there all the time? Is this like when you're there researching, are there other folk there doing other things, or is this considered, I mean, like a very risky thing to do?
It might depend a little bit on who you ask.
Okay.
Maybe people are a little too polite to tell it to my face that I'm insane, but no, there's actually a tremendous number of people. There are people all over the globe that go in and do research on different species, not just animal, but plant life as well. And then there's, I work primarily out of the Belarusian portion of the exclusion zone. It's a larger portion and it has less human activity. So wolves tend to avoid human activity, and it's a better region to trap wolves in. And they have researchers that are in and out of the zone constantly. There are always a subset of radioecologists and other researchers that are in and out.
Oh my God, that's so incredible. I want to read I grabbed something from one of your colleagues, Shane Campbell Staten. I think that's how you say the hyphen. Shane, I apologize if I messed up your the hyphen. But he said something really great that I put in here. He goes, gray wolves offer a really interesting opportunity to understand the impacts of chronic, low-dose, multi-generational exposure to ionizing radiation because of their role that they play in their ecosystems. How, when you look at this as you're going through this, Cara, how lucky are you guys? Like, do you sit back and just say, wow, we are extremely fortunate to have this apex predator that is thriving, and go into that too. What are the populations like in these areas? Because wolves are really repopulating, re-engaging in Europe, and obviously in Poland, Ukraine, Belarus. I mean, just talk about, I guess, what Shane said, and then on top of that, give people an insight into what the populations look like, what the wolves look like. It seems as though they're just living their lives and just getting a healthy dose of radiation every day, right?
Right. Yeah. So kind of to follow up on Shane's comment, he was absolutely right. So these doses are lower than you might get in a lot of cancer treatments, but they're chronic.
Yeah.
They're multi-generational, right?
Yeah.
We have, from our collar data, we know that our wolves very rarely leave the exclusion zone. So they really tend to stay exclusively within the exclusion zone. Even though there's no fences or anything physically containing them there. There's human activity outside of the zone, but that's probably the biggest factor in that regard. But kind of if we extrapolate that out and then we compare it to genetic signatures that we're seeing of relatedness between Chernobyl wolves and wolves from northern Belarus, we see some sort of division. And so we can start to hypothesize that these individuals have been exposed for multiple generations. And then I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but because of their trophic level, they're exposed to even a higher level of radiation than a lot of organisms are, because they're eating organisms that are also eating organisms that are exposed to radiation. So it's biomagnifying. So, they might eat a boar, which is then eating sometimes even a rodent that is eating seeds that was, each level of this can increase the amount of radiation that goes through the trophic levels and are accumulated. So by studying an apex predator, it might, I mean, we don't know enough yet, but it might give us this more dramatic signature of selection, giving these higher levels of exposure.
Hmm. And do you know offhand pack size and just population generalities? And
Yeah, so we don't have a great idea of the number of packs or pack size, but we do know that the density of wolves within Chernobyl has been measured to be 7 times higher than a preserve that is not Chernobyl. So if we go to a national park that is outside of the exclusion zone, but still in Belarus, very close, it's even with like just within the dispersal distance of the exclusion zone, it has 7 times lower wolf density than the exclusion zone itself. But there's also more human activity.
wow.
So, it's radiation is this stressor that you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't really sense it, or at least we can't in any way that I know of. But if you are a wolf and you leave the zone, chances of encountering a hunter or encountering a negative human interaction are way higher. There's a reward for hunting a wolf in Belarus. They're even persecuted for a really high reward monetarily. So they seem to avoid human interaction more so than any potential radiation.
Yeah, I was just kind of reading about that. Before I ask about that, there's this thriving wolf population. I guess we can assume that there's a thriving prey base. What does that look like, and what species are they hunting mostly?
Yeah, so it seems to depend a bit on the year. My first year there, the boar population was really high, and that seemed to be their primary prey base. Since then, there were a couple of diseases that went through the boar population and that declined. But there are lots of moose, there are lots of roe deer, there are, there are bison. I personally don't have any anecdotal evidence that they eat baby bison, but it theoretically could happen. And then there are a huge number of smaller mammals as well. But roe deer and moose are probably the most common prey species at the moment, as far as I'm aware.
So what about those species, the prey base? Are they sort of flocking to this area in compared to the surrounding areas as well? I mean, does it seem like a hot spot for critters? Because every picture makes it look like it is.
Right.
A lot of different species surviving.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of biodiversity that are surviving there. And I don't think we have the data, at least to my knowledge, we don't have the data to really say if these individuals are coming in great number. I have no evidence to suggest that. If anything, I would suggest that the populations are able to reproduce at such a level that they're like increasing their numbers without being hunted, which is kind of rare for the surrounding area. And, we just don't know enough about the long-term radiation impacts on the diverse species that are there to know exactly how much the radiation is kind of interacting with all of them. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of biodiversity, and the population seem to be doing very well relatively. Wow. I mean, the studies of even just like scavenger interactions and things are very robust, and there are many levels in every system that I'm aware of that have been studied. So
wow,
it's kind of remarkable. But like we mentioned, it's also used as a preserve, and species have been reintroduced to the area, like the Przewalski's horse, and the bison are there now. And I think you mentioned bear and Eurasian lynx, and all these species that are really rare in other areas have been able to kind of get a stronghold there again. So, it's this huge tragedy, absolutely, but there's also kind of the silver lining of this amazing biodiverse area.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to ask when you ended your last statement was just about any conflict with the surrounding villages. I was reading some articles about it. Yeah, I'm just wondering what your understanding or your experience is with that relationship.
Yeah. So I think it's, I mean, almost anywhere you have wolves and humans interact, you have this narrative, right? That they are taking livestock, they are a huge threat to pets. Um, and from our collar data, because we have no real evidence that they're leaving the zone very frequently, it's hard to tell how much of it is kind of lore and how much of it is truth from the wolves from the exclusion zone actually having those interactions with the surrounding area. There are definitely times where it has happened, and I don't know the frequency of livestock being killed. There are, cattle farms, there are horse farms, pig farms that surround the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So there definitely is access to livestock. And that's definitely the fear of the people living there. And part of, last I looked, average income is around maybe $5,000 a year, but the reward for a wolf was about 100 or $150. So not only might you have this emotional reaction of not wanting to interact with the wolf for your pets or for the livestock, but you also have this huge monetary gain if you're able to catch one and hand it in. So
Man, it's why, I mean, it I'm sure it doesn't help the big bad wolf theory that, they're in a zone that is full of radiation and it's, because a lot of what you see, and I'm sure you've seen this too, Cara, when they talk about this, the first thing that you see is mutated in some like mutated wolf or mutated wolf gene. So it just obviously it compounds everything that we've heard for 400, 500 years or whatever about wolves, or longer than that. When do you think, and when did, because obviously we're talking about the radiation, and obviously it leads to how can this help the human side of this, right? And can't, like we said, cancer and all that. When did that start to come to the forefront when you guys were studying? Was that an initial, we're going to dive in and see if this is something that can help humans, or was this like a subset of what you guys were finding out? What was where did that dot start to connect about maybe possibly down the road we can see genetically how this could help, cancer patients, tumors, tumor growth, et cetera, for humans?
yeah. So it wasn't one of the initial hypotheses just because we didn't know enough about the system. I think maybe it was a hope, but it was, you have so many hypotheses going into a new system and really trying to determine what is going on. So once we first characterized how much radiation the individuals were exposed to, I collected blood like we talked about. And one of the next questions was there sign of physiological stress within the individuals in response to that radiation exposure? And what we know from humans is that radiation impacts different types of immune cells in different ways. And kind of the ratios of how those immune cells turn up in the body can be indicative of radiation exposure. And so we used the blood from the wolves, and sure enough, we saw really dramatic signatures of physiological stress within the immune cell populations. And it was kind of that with the high radiation doses that was the moment that we were like, we really think this might be a strong enough signature to be a driving force of selection within this population. But you never really know until you look, right? So then every kind of layer that we add, we've looked at lots of gene expression patterns. We've looked at the gene sequence patterns, and every layer we put on just kind of makes that hypothesis stronger and stronger. And again, because they're so closely related to the domestic dog that is this amazing cancer model for humans already, we have a tremendous data set to go back to and better understand the patterns that we see in the wolf and how that might relate to cancer development. Dogs and wolves develop a lot of the same spontaneous cancers as humans. Their immune response is very similar to those cancers as humans. So by looking at the analogous patterns, we can better characterize how the wolf is responding to a possible cancer stress, and then vice versa, right? We know so much about cancer biology. There's still so much to learn, but we actually do know a fair amount about cancer biology in humans and dogs, but particularly we know about like genetic sequences that predispose somebody to being more susceptible to cancer or to having a worse diagnosis because of a genetic sequence. We know far less about the genetic sequences that might be able to confer resistance or resilience to cancer, which is one of the ways that natural selection could come up with this really novel answer to this complex biological question that just we as humans haven't come across yet. So if we kind of merge these different fields and different data sets, we're working with a couple cancer research groups now to see how applicable this is to be able to translate what we're seeing in the wolf to actual human therapies as well. But yeah, every layer we add seems more promising, but you know, cautiously optimistic. I think we won't know until we have a full-on answer, but every step is a step closer.
So what body of research did you use or did you reference to compare the genetic makeup of Chernobyl wolves to wolves outside of Chernobyl and other parts of the world to say, oh, there's something different happening here than happens normally in wolves in the context of cancer?
Yeah, so initially we used a reference population from northern Belarus that's not exposed but still within dispersal distance. And then we use Yellowstone as like a complete reference, right? Geographically, exposure, everything. And then there are ways that you can measure how quickly genetic sequence is evolving. And if we're able to target areas within the genome that are very specific to the Chernobyl population in comparison to these two other populations and show the signature of selection that's just really rapid and significant within Chernobyl specifically, then we dig deeper into those genes. And when we look at those genes, then we pull in the cancer data set from the humans and the dogs, and we look at the physiological functions that we know about in those two species. And the genes that we're identifying have a lot of immune targets. So they have a lot of immune function regulation. They have a lot of cancer biology or cancer immune interaction functions. And some specifically have anti-tumor immune function within their characterized physiological implications in humans and dogs. So,
wow, that's insane.
That is cool.
I mean, you just think about like when you're talking about, I want to go back because it's very rare when we get somebody who can talk about, genes and mapping and stuff. When you're talking about laying genes, like another layer of genes, when you were talking, I guess when you're doing the testing, what does that entail or what is that proving? I guess, is it, you start with the base layer and you say, okay, these match, and then you go the next layer up and these match. Like, what is that test for? Is it just to see how close you can get to the ultimate goal of this will absolutely positively work, or as close to positively work as possible, I guess, if you want to say that?
Yeah. So far, we really just take the sequence and we identify the gene and we try to hypothesize different physiological implications of the changes in that gene. But that's really complicated because a gene is made up of lots of different base pairs. And some genes have many different base pairs that are different in Chernobyl. Some might mean something, some might not. It's kind of teasing that apart, which is one of the next steps that we're going into, is to put these sequences into a functional test and actually put them into a cancer cell per se and see how they interact with the cancer environment. Do they actually have a physiological implication at that level? And we can scale up to many different levels above that. But that jump between the gene and proving the function takes many steps. No matter how much we know, even if we were working in the same species and we knew a tremendous amount within the wolves, we could only predict a certain amount without really taking it and doing some functional assays in the lab, which include things like cell culture. So it's a long process, but it's something we've started. So stay tuned, I think, to see where it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what's the, I guess if you were looking, because how long did this, just getting to this point, this is what, close to a decade, right? Just compiling all of this up. What do you, and again, this is always the question that, I hate to ask scientists or biologists, because science it's ever evolving and it's ever changing. Be like, oh, it could take us 5 years, and then tomorrow they're like, we got it. So you never know. But if you were to look at the data set and all the stuff that you have right now, what's the anticipated, I guess, date, or how many years do you think it's going to take to compile to get to the point, I guess, where you could say, hey, this is viable and we have something that could actually help those that are in need of this incredibly terrible disease and formation of tumors and things like that? What's the ultimate futuristic outcome that you think you guys are heading towards?
Yeah, gosh, I'm going to give a really unsatisfying answer of just
That's
we
fine.
don't know. And it
That's
really
fine.
depends on the data, right? It's I think both Shane and I are so excited about this story and just where the data takes us. We try not to obviously we make hypotheses and prioritize certain data ahead of others, but it really is just waiting for the data to tell the story and see where it takes us for how long it might take us to get there. Um, you know, any one experiment can take months, but who knows how many you might have to do to be able to get to an endpoint that you can then safely and confidently translate into a human model or a human trial. So
Right. Yeah, are there
who
any
knows?
plans? Yeah, I know. Are there any plans? Well, I didn't ask this first. How big is the CEZ, the exclusion zone? Is it, because I know it encompasses, is it Ukraine, Belarus, and part of Russia, or not? Or is it just Belarus and Ukraine? Or
It's
just
just
Belarus?
Belarus and Ukraine, and
Okay.
it's about 4,000 square kilometers
Okay.
is
All
the
right. So it's
exclusion zone.
it's fairly large. Are there any plans to go back, or is that part of your guys' research done? Do you guys are there plans to go back, check on some of the wolves that you've gotten information from to see, just to track, or do you guys still get those readings? Where do those data points sit?
Yeah, so I have not been there since pre-COVID, unfortunately. COVID hit first and we were trying to go back after that. And now, obviously, with the war and the geopolitical situation, our biggest priority is just to make sure that friends and colleagues are as safe as they can be. Um, so field work for our team has been halted just to make sure everybody stays safe at the moment. But we're very fortunate to have a lot of data in hand that we're still able to move forward with. um, I'm excited to be able to move forward with other species as well and kind of see if these patterns, now that we kind of have the model of the wolf, if we can start to build up some of these other species to see if we seem to see similar patterns in other species as well, or if it's just unique within the wolf. Either is possible. Um, so there are ways that we can continue the research, but unfortunately, we aren't on the ground in Chernobyl at the moment.
Right. And what are those other species that you guys are comparing this with?
So the second species, primary species that we're working with is the raccoon dog. It's another canid. They're small, fluffy creatures. If you aren't familiar, I highly recommend that you look them up. They're adorable. Um,
They're cool.
and so we're going to follow up with the raccoon dog, and as data and allows, we'll try and add as many more as we can, different taxa as well.
And as we get to this, when is there, other than articles, are there places where people can read the research as it stands right now? Are you guys putting out any papers? Is there places where they can go to see where it is at this point so that they can read the literature or see a blog? Is there a place where people can go to see not only your research, your and Shane's research, and others that have worked on this, so that they can get a more lengthy, I guess, version of what's happening?
Yeah, so we don't have a blog at the moment. We have a couple papers that are in the works that are going to be focusing more on kind of the selection portion of the data that I've talked about. But a lot of the radiation dose and more of like the biodiverse communities that are there, we've published a lot on those already, and those are available on my website and a lot of my collaborators' websites as well. So um, hopefully there will be a couple more manuscripts in the next few months available on the selection end too.
Nice.
Cool.
And are you guys the coolest research lab on Princeton because of this stuff. Is really the other thing I think people would want to know.
Gosh, not even. Oh my gosh, there's so much cool research that happens here. It is a very inspiring place to be, and it's never a dull moment. There is just, everybody has just such a cool story and such a cool system. It's
so cool.
An amazing community.
Yeah.
Last question for you, Cara, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Oh, good question. There's a piece of art that comes to mind that is kind of like a silhouette of a wolf for some reason. No
Cool.
idea why.
Cool.
That's a first. That's the first one. I love it.
Yeah, love it.
So I'm sure people are listening will be keeping tabs, but Cara Love, thank you so much for going into a place such as Chernobyl and coming out with, like you say, out of tragedy has come some positivity and some sanctuary for other beings and some people who are turning back. So thank you for all the research you, Shane, and everyone else is doing. It's incredible work, and we'll keep everyone posted once we get those answers, right?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
It was great. Yeah, just hang tight while we sign off. How's to y'all out there, and Stephen, I'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.